I'm interested in the macro focus on things, the broad focus, obviously, and especially the convergence of technological innovation and globalization, and the sort of downward pressure they put on education and educational reform. So I'm in education policy, and I'm particularly interested in public policy and its application to education. Intuitively, I resonate with the idea that globalization has a strong sort of magnetic pull on policymakers. Though on a local level, I always debate this, I was debating this here, on a local level people don't see that because they're usually responding to whatever the issue of the day is and whatever their constituents require, whatever they think their policies in order to get reelected or whatever, whoever they might be, require. But I really think globalization, and I am in a global studies program at the University of Illinois, so that, that is sort of the water in which I swim, so I guess it's sort of taken for granted there that globalization is an important dimension of understanding education policy, particularly neoliberalism and the need for, understanding how that impacts why policies are constructed, particularly over the last 30 years, and where we could possibly go from here, going beyond neoliberalism ideally, and in what direction. If you look at the sort of the foundations of education on a mass level, mass industrial education, they're interdependent with factories and industrial systems. And so what we call mass education today is very much the outcome of the industrial process. So I mean, at least as we understand education in the modern era, they're interdependent. Could we go beyond it so that we could have an education system that supports, more than just factory workers or human capital? That would be ideal. But I think there'll always be some dimension of the economy in how we construct education systems, because we're, in a capitalist age, we're interested in return on investment. And if taxpayers are going to pay for something, they want to think that there's some value that comes out of it, whether that value is, workers, or that value is well-educated citizens, which is perhaps the more, the more ethically important, I guess. But nonetheless, the economy still is significant to why we have education systems at all. My dissertation essentially focuses on the idea that there isn't one knowledge economy, there's many knowledge economies. And the fact is that a lot of our educational reform is grounded in the idea that we're heading towards one singular alternative or post-industrial era. And the fact is there are many post-industrial eras that are bumping off each other. You can think of the green economy, which the Barack Obama administration has invested a lot in, especially the investment in STEM. And then in turn you have the creative economy, which Richard Florida and a lot of other people have spoken quite eloquently about, I think. And then you have what you might call the commons economy or the open knowledge economy, which seems to be in some ways post-capitalist or idealizing an alternative to intellectual property and the foundations of the capitalist system. So in some ways it's neo-Marxist, I guess. There are a lot of neo-Marxists that are interested in that space. But these three different paradigms are quite different, and they have different implications. So if we build in educational reform, we have to think about what we're reforming for. Are we reforming for the green economy? Are we reforming for maintenance of the industrial system but at a more advanced level? Or is it the open knowledge economy? Is that in a way kind of, if not more valuable, then perhaps more contemporary? But having said all that, we just don't know. And I think speculating in any one direction is a gamble. And so I'm making the argument that no matter where you put your money, as a nation state, no matter where you put your money, it's a gamble. And so I think there's too much hubris in the argument that the knowledge economy is where we're headed and there's no alternative to that. I think that's not just naive, it's exaggerated. I mean, I do think there's a fundamental shift at work, and a lot of it has to do with China in particular, but industrialized economies as well. On the one hand, the United States is trying to find a more, in a sense, a standardized model of education so that there's more equity across the board, across the country, because it's a very large country, with a diversified education system, certainly up until now. But then at the same time, China, which seems to have, a strength in standardization and has for almost centuries, is worried that, that level of uniformity in the education system and sort of top-down reform or top-down standardization, that those things don't lead to creativity and innovation, and that they often block students from creating the kinds of innovations that are necessary to stoke the economy. So I think the concern on both sides, and in China in particular, the concern is we're not creative enough, we need to do more. And in the United States, the question is how can we maintain our creativity in order to go forward into a post-industrial future? And so there's this friction between how loose the education system should be and how anchored it should be to a testing regime, essentially, an assessment system. That's what some people are talking about, like mass localism, right? In a sense, the United States was built out of multiple education systems that converged over time. So, I mean, and there's a lot of strength in that because you can, through trial and error, through a sort of natural selection, figure out which models work best for which local constituencies and which have the best output, whether it's quality or assessment or creativity or whatever it might be. So in a way, that is the preferred ideal, but it also leaves holes around equity. You know, some students just don't get the benefits, whether it's because of the tax base, you know, the community they live in, or because of systemic racism or some other issues. So it creates all kinds of challenges when it's diversified to that level, when it's sort of a mesh system. You can't account for quality across the board. But when it's too standardized, you can't allow for trial and error experimentation. So it's obviously a balance somewhere between the two that you're looking for. Well, the premises for economics is it's land, labor, and capital goods. That was the foundation of the industrial system, foundation of capitalism. But now the ideal is knowledge as a good. So knowledge as an abstraction, or knowledge as intellectual property, or knowledge as know-how, knowledge as practice. But you know, it's a bit fuzzy in a way. You know, it's hard to get your head around. But the idea underlying it is that innovation and knowledge are interdependent, and you can't have innovation simply because of land, labor, or capital. Those things don't, in and of themselves, produce innovation. And if the whole global system is a competition around innovation, then there's some other factor that matters, perhaps more than the other three. And so the argument is, well, then it's knowledge. But what is that? You know, what is knowledge? Is it creativity? Is it advanced research? You know, this is where universities come into play, because they produce some of the basic research that then becomes applied through the private sector often, and produces globally competitive products and services. So it's interdependent with this argument that the university is key to wherever we're going, right? The post-industrial age. And therefore we need more education, better education, high-quality education. We need the best human capital possible to compete. The United States has been the sort of undisputed hegemonic champion for a long time, but I think that's changing. And I think that there'll be a big need for negotiation across competitive spheres. So I think building bridges between the United States and China, between the U.S. and Europe and Russia and Brazil and India, I think those are pretty key. Because, you know, a lot of people say that when you have a multipolar world, you can have a lot of room for misunderstanding and instability and possibly war, or whether it's over resources or energy or whatever it might be. So there's always the need for peacemakers, I guess. And so I like to think that that's the right direction, if not for me, for the future.